rain hammered the Seattle windows when my phone buzzed across the counter like a guilty insect, and I saw a preview I was never meant to see. Olivia Hart said, "Whose number is that, Dan?" Daniel Mercer said, "A client. Late invoice." The banner glowed again, and the words stabbed cleanly. "I missed last night. Same time?" My stomach folded on itself. I pressed the screen and unlocked the thread, and a voice memo sat there like a live wire. Olivia Hart said, "Play it, or I will." Daniel Mercer said, "You are overreacting." I hit play, and a whisper drifted out, warm and careless, "I do not think she will ever find out." The faucet hissed like static, and my breath misted in the cold. He reached for the phone and my palm moved before my thoughts did. The slap landed, small and bright, and then the silence widened into a canyon. Daniel Mercer said, "Are you serious right now?" Olivia Hart said, "You did this." The city lights smeared through the rain like confetti from a funeral, and the last neat version of us unspooled. He stared at the floor, jaw tight, and I realized I had crossed the line between doubt and proof. Olivia Hart said, "Who is she?" Daniel Mercer said, "It is nothing." Nothing looked like a message that smelled like perfume and set everything on fire. The silence kept ringing long after the sound died, and I could hear the rain arguing with the street. Daniel Mercer said, "We can talk when you calm down." Olivia Hart said, "I am calm. I am done being blind." He took off his navy coat and hung it like nothing was burning. I watched his back and saw the charm I had defended at dinner tables and office parties. Friends called him magnetic, and I wore their praise like proof. I thought of the lease with both our names, the mugs we argued over, the plans for a dog in the spring. Olivia Hart said, "I trusted you." Daniel Mercer said, "It was a mistake, and it is already handled." Handled sounded like a lid clamped over a scream. I remembered the way he smoothed my hair when deadlines chewed me up, and how he always reached for my hand in traffic. The memories tried to bargain for his innocence, and I felt gullible for letting them. Olivia Hart said, "Was it her in my car last week?" He did not answer, and the clock forgot how to move. If love is a house, I was sweeping up glass while pretending the windows were fine. I looked at the phone, at the chat that suddenly felt like a public crime scene. Olivia Hart said, "Say her name." Daniel Mercer said, "You do not want this." But I already had it, and it would not stop burning. I rewound the last month in fast cuts, and every scene I trusted turned grainy. Olivia Hart said, "You started parking 2 blocks away." Daniel Mercer said, "Street cleaning." The receipts in his jacket pocket did not know our neighborhood, and the cologne on his collar was not ours. His phone learned new habits, always face down, always on silent, always another meeting. Olivia Hart said, "You changed your laptop password." Daniel Mercer said, "Security audit." The night stretched longer, and his voice came back from nowhere with a softness reserved for someone not me. A lipstick stain ghosted a travel mug I never used, and I told myself it was a smudge from the store. Olivia Hart said, "I begged you to look me in the eye." He would kiss my forehead and promise a weekend away, and I would swallow the questions to keep the peace. My reflection in the microwave looked like a stranger who practiced being fine. Daniel Mercer said, "We can fix this if you stop digging." Olivia Hart said, "Truth does not need hiding." I realized the clues had been kneeling in plain sight, and my loyalty blocked the light. The thread on my screen kept pulsing, and the night felt suddenly airless. I walked to the bedroom and closed the door on the kitchen hum, and my hands shook around the phone as I called Marcus. Marcus Lee said, "You never call this late, Liv." Olivia Hart said, "I found messages and a voice memo. She said I would never find out." Silence came first, then a careful breath that sounded like triage. Marcus Lee said, "Listen to me, do not confront blind. Gather proof." Olivia Hart said, "I already did, and I slapped him." Marcus Lee said, Okay, no more hands, you are smarter than his story. He had warned me once when Dan missed my birthday dinner, and I shrugged it off as work. I felt the shame rise, heavy and metallic, and I hated that it belonged to me and not to him. Marcus Lee said, "Do you want me there?" Olivia Hart said, "Not yet. I need him to say it." The rain drummed on the window, and a police siren braided into it like a second heartbeat. I opened the closet and stared at the suitcase we used for happy trips that now looked like a fire exit. Marcus Lee said, "If he lies again, I'm on my way." Olivia Hart said, "Thank you." His steadiness reached across the line, and for a second, the floor felt less tilted. I put the phone down and squared my shoulders for the next cut. I stepped back into the kitchen, and the apartment smelled like rain and scorched nerves. Daniel Mercer said, "We can move past this if you stop imagining things." Olivia Hart said, "Imagination does not leave voice memos." He opened the fridge as if a beer could rewrite the last 5 minutes. I watched the way his shoulders squared, the way his eyes skated past mine, like a man looking for an exit sign. Daniel Mercer said, "I was protecting you." Olivia Hart said, "From the truth?" The phone vibrated again on the counter, and both our gazes locked on it like prey watches a trap. He reached first, but I was faster, and the name on the screen split the room. "Olivia Hart," said Harper Lane. Daniel Mercer said, "She is a co-worker. She needed help." The lie walked in with a friendly face and set its suitcase down between us. I put the phone in my pocket and felt my pulse steady into something colder than grief. Olivia Hart said, "We are not sleeping this under the rug." Daniel Mercer said, "Be reasonable." Reason had left with the first chime, and certainty stood in its place, quiet and sharp. Olivia Hart said, "You will tell me everything, and you will not like who I become if you do not." The rain softened to a hush, but the ache sharpened like glass under skin. Olivia Hart said, "I need to remember why I loved you." I traced the groove on our table where we carved a clumsy heart. Daniel Mercer said, "We are bigger than a fight." I remembered the bookstore where he reached the last copy down for me. He grinned like trouble, and kindness had made a pact. Olivia Hart said, "You made room for my loud dreams." He once drove an hour to bring soup to my cubicle when I was sick. Daniel Mercer said, "I wanted you to feel chosen." I believed him, and I stitched that feeling into my bones. We built holidays with paper garlands and burned cookies and laughter. Olivia Hart said, "I built a life on your promises." I can hold the good and still see the ruin. The good does not cancel the bruise, and the bruise does not erase the good. Daniel Mercer said, "I love you, live." The words sounded like a familiar song, leaking from a house that is already on fire, and I stood outside, shivering and listening. Memory broke the night open and let summer in. We were on the coast, wind tossing our cheap kite against a sky of salt. Daniel Mercer said, "If it crashes, we rebuild." Olivia Hart said, "That is the deal." He chased the tail across the sand and looked back like he was checking. I was still there. I laughed into the wind and believed staying was easy. We ate fries out of a paper boat and stained our fingers with vinegar. Daniel Mercer said, "I want a tiny house with big windows." Olivia Hart said, "And a loud dog." He kissed my temple and promised me the windows. I promised him I would try to believe in happy endings. The ocean wrote our names and then took them back. Olivia Hart said, "Nothing perfect lasts." Daniel Mercer said, "We do." I filed the vow beside my heartbeat, and that is why tonight hurts like pulling out a nail that grew around a lie. I learned early that love can vanish mid-sentence. My mother kept a bag packed by the closet for years. Olivia Hart said, "We are fine," even when the rent was a debate and dinner was cereal. She worked doubles and still wrote notes on my lunch napkins. Olivia Hart said, "I will never settle for half love." Then I met a man who sounded like certainty. Daniel Mercer said, "I am not going anywhere." The child in me curled around that sentence like a blanket. I Marcus Lee said, "Trust, but bring your eyes." I tried, and then I wanted rest more than accuracy. I kept forgiving as if peace could be bartered. Olivia Hart said, "I ignored the alarms because silence felt holy. Tonight I am learning that quiet can be a cover. The old fear steps out of storage, and I look it in the face." Olivia Hart said, "I will not be the girl who waits at the window for a car that never turns the corner." Our rituals were small, and they made a home. Saturday pancakes that looked like maps and tasted like truce. Daniel Mercer said, "You flip, I burn." Olivia Hart said, "You charm, I plan." We planted a basil pot that died every winter and tried again in spring. He left notes in my shoes before presentations. Olivia Hart said, "You have got this," written in his quick slant. Daniel Mercer said, "I am proud of you," whispered even when I missed. The ordinary felt sacred, and I worshipped it. I built calendars and recipes and playlists around us. Olivia Hart said, "I wanted boring with you forever." He smiled like a contract. Tonight I see how easily rituals can be counterfeits. They are real, but they are not proof. Love needs truth, or it curdles. Olivia Hart said, "I will not hang my life on paper hearts and sticky notes if the spine is hollow." Dawn sharpened the edges of the room and left nowhere to hide. The rain paused, and the city inhaled. Daniel Mercer said, "We can start clean." Olivia Hart said, "Clean means honest, and we are not there." The phone on the counter was a lighthouse and a warning. I could see the rocks and the shore at once. Marcus Lee said, "Tell the truth you can live with tomorrow." I am not here to punish the past, but I will not rent tomorrow to a lie. Daniel Mercer said, "I made mistakes." Olivia Hart said, "Then say the names and the times." My hands steadied on the back of a chair like it was a rail on a moving train. I chose myself out loud for the first time, and the words settled like anchors. Olivia Hart said, "I am worth the unedited version." The night that broke me also drew a border around my heart, and I finally stepped to my side of the line. Morning bleached the night from the walls, but the lies did not evaporate with the steam from my mug. Daniel Mercer said, "Let's reset today." Olivia Hart said, "Truth before reset." He kissed my hair like punctuation and grabbed his keys too quickly. Our shared calendar sprouted gray boxes, labeled client review with no addresses. Olivia Hart said, "Which client at 10? Daniel Mercer said, "Fourth and Pine, quick deck walk through." My bank alert chirped about a rideshare to Ravenna at the same time. The route trace showed a stop near a cafe with a back alley entrance. Daniel Mercer said, "Driver detoured for construction." His answers stacked with dealer precision, neat and slippery. I cross-checked a photo he posted to the team chat, and the window light angle contradicted the timestamp. Olivia Hart said, "Your normal keeps changing." Daniel Mercer said, "So does traffic live." I screenshotted everything, and the evidence lined up like chairs for an unwelcome meeting. The initials at the top of his favorites glared like a neon sign, and the H felt louder than the rest of the alphabet. At lunch, I walked the blocks he named, and the office lobby air smelled like eucalyptus and money. Olivia Hart said, "Do you have a Daniel Mercer meeting today?" The receptionist shrugged with the boredom of certainty. Daniel Mercer said, running late, "Client chaos," through a text that pinged like a staged alibi. I watched the elevators inhale suits that were not him. A janitor mopped a clean floor, and that felt like a metaphor I did not want. I circled the building and found a back lot with a private entrance. Olivia Hart said, "You hate back doors." Daniel Mercer said, "Sometimes shortcuts save time." A black sedan idled with its blinker ticking like a metronome for liars. The driver opened a trunk and revealed a bouquet sleeve tossed aside. I took a photo, and my hands did not shake. The rain began in polite dots, and the street shivered with reflections. Olivia Hart said, "If love requires shadows, it is not love." My phone battery slid to red, but my focus held steady like a lens, locked on the only subject that mattered. I met Marcus at a cafe that forgave bad days with strong coffee and quiet corners. Marcus Lee said, "Bring everything you cannot unsee." Olivia Hart said, "I have roots, receipts, and a heartbeat that flinches at the letter H." He scanned my screenshots like triage and slid a notebook between us. Marcus Lee said, "Build a timeline and highlight the tells." He drew columns for calls, arrivals, and gaps that swallowed explanations. Olivia Hart said, "If I am wrong, I ruin us twice." Marcus Lee said, "Truth does not bruise that way." He showed me how patterns harden into proof when excuses repeat. I core 9. We marked the night. My car smelled like perfume I do not wear. We circled the day. His phone learned to live face down. Olivia Hart said, "I wanted a future more than I wanted answers." Marcus Lee said, "Want both." His steadiness steadied me, and the page filled with lines that pointed toward the same door. The cafe lights hummed, and for once the noise sounded like courage. By evening I stood on the sidewalk near the address from the rideshare log, and stared at a narrow bar with fogged windows. Daniel Mercer said, "Late client drinks," through a text that felt pre-rehearsed. A familiar laugh spilled from the door and twisted my spine. Harper Lane said, "You are impossible," in a voice I recognized from the memo. Olivia Hart said, "Not a coworker emergency." I did not step inside, because I wanted clarity more than spectacle. Through the window I saw him lean in, body angled like a secret passing hands. Harper wore a red scarf that matched the stain on the old travel mug. Daniel Mercer said, "We cannot stay long," and the sentence landed like a breadcrumb pointing toward another lie. I took 3 photos and captured a timeline that could not be argued. The bartender wiped a clean glass with ritual care, and the ritual looked honest only because it had nothing to hide. Olivia Hart said, "I am witnessing my life from outside the glass." The night pressed closer, and I learned how silence can also be strategy. Back home I spread the evidence on the table like a map of a coastline crumbling into the sea. Olivia Hart said, "If I confront now, he will sprint for the exit of doubt." Marcus Lee said, "Make him talk himself into the truth." I labeled each screenshot with time, place, and the lie attached like a sticky note to a broken vase. Daniel Mercer said, "Late night, big push," in a text that begged to be the last of its kind. I set an alarm for dawn and drafted questions that did not allow detours. Olivia Hart said, "Name the cafe, name the scarf, name the rideshare stop." The room felt colder, and I opened a window to let the city breathe for me. I placed the phone on airplane mode, like a museum piece, with a plaque that read "Finally Seen." Marcus Lee said, "You choose the venue, you choose the tempo." I chose morning, because daylight does not flinch. The clock moved with the stubborn grace of healing bones. I stood in that slow march and felt my fear become a tool, not a cage. Dawn rinsed the night from the glass, and the kitchen looked honest enough to hurt. Daniel Mercer said, "Let's pretend yesterday was noise." Olivia Hart said, "Truth, then breakfast." He moved like routine could bribe gravity. I placed the timeline on the island and watched him skim, then blink too slowly at the red circles. Daniel Mercer said, "You are building stories from static." Olivia Hart said, "Static does not wear a red scarf." His phone lit the counter with a banner from an unsaved number. He palmed it, and the move felt practiced. Olivia Hart said, "Read it here." Daniel Mercer said, "Confidential." The word scraped my ribs because it once meant romance. I pointed at the rideshare stop by the alley bar and the receipt for flowers that never reached our table. Daniel Mercer said, "Clients send thank yous." Olivia Hart said, "Not to their own addresses." The kettle clicked, loud like a gavel, and the steam made the room look like a stage set. He reached for 2 mugs as if service could absolve him. Olivia Hart said, "Name the cafe, or I call Harper at lunch." Daniel Mercer said, "Do not do that." Fear finally had a voice, and it was his. By mid-morning I tailed his route at a distance like caution had learned to drive. Daniel Mercer said, running between meetings, through a text that landed too smoothly. The garage under 5th smelled like rain and rubber and secrets. I parked 2 levels down, then climbed the stairwell where echoes sounded like second thoughts. Harper Lane said, 15 minutes from somewhere above, light and breathless. Olivia Hart said, not a crisis then. An elevator chimed, and I saw his reflection in the steel before I saw him. He checked his phone, smoothed his shirt, and smiled into the blank doors. Daniel Mercer said, make it quick to no one I could see. I held the railing and counted my inhale to 4. The doors opened, and a woman's laugh spilled out like a confession with good posture. Olivia Hart said, I will not make a scene. The elevator closed on their silhouettes, and the arrow blinked up. My patience rode with it. Marcus met me on the sidewalk with coffee, and a plan that did not require magic. Marcus Lee said, ask for verifiable now. Olivia Hart said, send me a selfie at the client lobby. I texted the request, and the typing dots pulsed like a held breath. Daniel Mercer said on it, and a photo arrived with his smile, aimed at a brass logo. Marcus traced the reflection in the plaque and tapped a tree line that did not match the block. Marcus Lee said, this is 4th Avenue, not 5th. Olivia Hart said, why lie about a photo you can take twice? My phone buzzed again with a second image, now correct, now careful. Daniel Mercer said, happy. The desperation hid behind the joke, but it leaked at the edges. Marcus Lee said, patterns harden, keep them visible. I saved both files and labeled them with the minute and the weather. Olivia Hart said, at 5, we talk without props. The sky lowered over the city like a ceiling that needed truth to lift. Afternoon folded into a gray that made time feel stalled, and the cafe hummed like a nerve. Marcus Lee said, there is one more thing. He slid a volunteer roster for a neighborhood fundraiser across the table. Harper Lane said, bake sale captain, on a line 2 rows below my name from last year. Olivia Hart said, she stood 10 feet from me. Memory rewound and placed her in a blue coat by the coffee urn, while Daniel loaded boxes. Daniel Mercer said, small world, when I thanked Harper for the extra napkins. Marcus Lee said, you asked me then if you were naive. I had laughed and changed the subject, because happy felt rare, and I did not want to bruise it. Olivia Hart said, you should have told me sooner. Marcus Lee said, I was waiting for certain. The word landed between us like an apology with splinters. I circled her name and felt the circle tighten. Olivia Hart said, tonight, I use their own map. The ache turned into architecture. At dusk I waited across from the bar's side door, where the alley pooled with neon and rain. Daniel Mercer said 15. Then I go in a text with the tone of a man talking to a clock. Harper Lane said, back table, through a message that arrived by mistake, copied to a thread without my name. Olivia Hart said, the universe has receipts. A cyclist hissed past, and the spray kissed my ankles. Through the fogged pane I saw him pick at the label on a bottle like guilt needed something to do with his hands. Harper leaned in and touched his sleeve with the ease of practice. Olivia Hart said, I wanted boring forever, but I want honest more. My phone camera caught their angle, the scarf, the glass, the time. A server glanced at me through the reflection and looked away, neutral and kind. Olivia Hart said 5 minutes, then I walk in. The countdown tasted like metal and mercy. I felt my pulse settle into a steady drum. I could march on. The bar smelled like limes and rain, and neon wrote shaky halos on the bottles when I stepped inside and did not blink. Daniel Mercer said, we were leaving. Harper Lane said, Olivia? Her voice fit the memo like a key sliding home. Olivia Hart said, coworker emergency, looks a lot like date night. Daniel Mercer said, we are discussing a proposal. The red scarf sat on the chair back like a flag that forgot how to hide. Olivia Hart said, Say the cafe from Tuesday. He glanced at Harper, and the pause testified better than any oath. Harper Lane said, "We did not mean to hurt you." The words were tidy and practiced, and they cracked like thin glass in my chest. I pulled out my phone, and the photos lined up like witnesses who refused to be intimidated. Daniel Mercer said, "You are making this ugly." Olivia Hart said, "Truth is not a decorator." The bartender drifted away the second he read the temperature. Harper Lane said, "Can we talk in private?" I remembered her laugh at the fundraiser and the blue coat by the coffee urn. The puzzle clicked, and the picture was a door I could not unopen. We slid into a back booth where the wall held a crooked mirror that refused to flatter. Harper Lane said, "We knew each other before you and Dan." Olivia Hart said, "From where?" She smiled like memory could soften a confession. Harper Lane said, "You sophomore year, sublet near 45th. You lent me your basil plant when I traveled." The memory rose with the smell of dorm coffee and cheap candles, and I hated that she had a key to my past. Daniel Mercer said, "It started as talking." Olivia Hart said, "Then it started earlier than you told me." Harper Lane said, "I reached out after the fundraiser, and we did not plan this." I saw her by the coffee urn, handing napkins to my guests, and I saw the door she kept open. Daniel Mercer said, "We were careful." Olivia Hart said, "Careful is what liars call considerate." The mirror caught us like a photo of a crime we were still committing, by breathing in the same booth. Harper Lane said, "You deserved honesty sooner." I let the sentence sit like a pen over a contract I would not sign. His phone buzzed, and a banner crawled across the lock screen like a confession with a tip jar. Harper Lane said, "Ignore it." Olivia Hart said, "Read it." Daniel Mercer said, "It is work." The preview showed a payment from Harper with a note that burned through the glass. Olivia Hart said, "Consulting on Olivia led." Silence fell so clean I could hear the ice surrender in my water. Daniel Mercer said, "I pitched a client you mentioned, and she looped me in." Harper Lane said, "It was mutual." The betrayal widened beyond the table and swallowed my calendar, my contacts, my trust in the walls of my own life. Olivia Hart said, "You used my network while you used my home." Daniel Mercer said, "We were helping each other." The mirror threw back a woman who did not accept that math. Olivia Hart said, "You staged alibis around my schedule to keep me busy while you met." Harper's throat worked, and no word came out. The banner faded, but the memo stayed stamped on the room. I pushed farther because rot never stops at the paint. Olivia Hart said, "Whose spare key opened my door last week?" Harper Lane said, "You gave me one in college and I kept it by mistake." The word mistake tried to dress theft in linen. Daniel Mercer said, "She watered the basil when we traveled." The basil died every winter, but apparently trust did not get that mercy. Olivia Hart said, "You sat on my couch and drank from my mug while I was at work." Harper Lane said, "I thought you would be late." The timeline in my head shifted, and the perfume in my car found its owner. Daniel Mercer said, "We were ending it." The same sentence has been rented by every coward I have ever met, and the lease always renews. Olivia Hart said, "You both chose proximity to me because it was convenient cover." The mirror caught us again, older than an hour ago. Harper Lane said, "Please do not torch my job." Olivia Hart said, "I am not your alibi, and I am not your shield." I stood to leave, and the room tilted back into place like a camera finding level after a faulty tripod. Daniel Mercer said, "We can fix this if you keep it between us." Olivia Hart said, "You already kept too much between us." Harper Lane said, "It was not a setup." My phone vibrated with a calendar alert I forgot to mute, and the title read "Lease Transfer Reminder" from a note Daniel sent last month. Olivia Hart said, "You wanted me out first." His face twitched, and the calculation showed its teeth. Daniel Mercer said, "We could not afford the penalty without your signature." The manipulation stepped out of costume and bowed to the crowd. Olivia Hart said, "You staged chaos to make me walk." Harper Lane said, I did not know that part. Maybe she did, and maybe she did not. But the ship was already under, and I was done bailing. I pocketed my proof and my name. Olivia Hart said, I decide what breaks, and it will not be me. The door let in the rain like applause that knew which side it was on. I texted him to come home, and the rain escorted him like a guilty entourage as Marcus waited by the window, with 2 coffees and a steadier pulse than mine. Daniel Mercer said, Why is he here? Olivia Hart said, Witness, not referee. He reached for a hug and found air, because the island between us now held the map of every lie. Marcus Lee said, We can keep voices low and facts high. I placed the photos in a row, and each timestamp blinked like a runway for truth. Daniel Mercer said, You are spinning stories. Olivia Hart said Ravenna 742, red scarf, back table. He looked at the floor, as if it owed him an alibi. Daniel Mercer said, It was closure. Olivia Hart said, It was rehearsal. The kettle clicked and released steam like a cue from the stage manager of our worst play. Marcus Lee said, Start answering or start packing. Daniel Mercer said, I love you, Liv. Olivia Hart said, Love does not rent exits and call them doors. The room held still and waited to see who would break first. I put his phone in the center like a courtroom microphone and did not blink. Olivia Hart said, Call Harper on speaker. Daniel Mercer said, This is cruel. Marcus Lee said, Cruel is lying with receipts. He dialed, and the ring sounded like a countdown with teeth. Harper Lane said, Back table again, or your place, and silence crashed so hard I felt it in my teeth. Olivia Hart said, We are all here. Harper Lane said, Oh, and the syllable snapped like a twig under a boot. Daniel Mercer said, I was ending it tonight. Olivia Hart said, You already ended us last month and forgot to mention it. Marcus Lee said, Confirm dates and times. Harper named 2 Tuesdays and a Friday that matched my rideshare log like locks, taking the right key. Daniel Mercer said, Hang up. Olivia Hart said, Leave it on until the truth finishes speaking. The call died anyway, and the dial tone felt like a curtain that refused to close. He pivoted like a man cornered by his own echo, and lobbed a story built from dust. Daniel Mercer said, You have not been present, and your career eats every room. Olivia Hart said, My career did not text itself from our couch. He said I forgot his rough weeks, and he felt small beside my wins. Olivia Hart said small is not the same as dishonest. Marcus Lee said, Feelings are not alibis. Daniel's voice rose and slapped the cabinets, and a neighbor thumped once like a judge with a tired gavel. Daniel Mercer said, I needed someone who saw me. Olivia Hart said, I saw you so well, I ignored the missing pieces. He listed grievances with polished edges, and everyone had a timestamp I had already checked. Olivia Hart said, You borrowed my future to fund your lies. The words tasted like metal and medicine. Marcus Lee said, Own it, or we call counsel. Daniel Mercer said, I am terrified. And for the first time, I believed something he said completely. I slid the lease addendum across the table with a pen that wrote like a verdict. Olivia Hart said, Sign, return my key, and pack essentials tonight. Daniel Mercer said, We can try counseling. Olivia Hart said, We can try honesty first, and you are late. Marcus Lee said, Initial here and here. His hand shook like a bridge in wind, and the ink spidered where a drop of sweat fell. Daniel Mercer said, You will regret this. Olivia Hart said, I regret not drawing this line sooner. He asked where he should go, and the question sounded like a man meeting his own voice. Olivia Hart said, Hotel couch friend, not here. Marcus slid a small envelope across the wood. Marcus Lee said, Document the handoff. Daniel Mercer placed a brass key beside my phone like a tired confession. The room exhaled, and the building hummed as if relieved we finally understood the rules again. When the pen stopped, The story started to confess on its own. Daniel Mercer said, "It began after the fundraiser planning, and I kept choosing the easy lie." Olivia Hart said, "Say it all." He admitted the spare key, the meetings mapped onto my calendar gaps, and the payments disguised as favors. Marcus Lee said, "Repeat the dates for the record," and the dates arrived like stones dropped in a still pond. Daniel Mercer said, "I am sorry," and the words sounded like towels thrown at a fire that had already eaten the house. Olivia Hart said, "You are sorry you lost control." He placed the key in my palm, warm and heavy as a final page. Marcus Lee said, "We are done here." I opened the door and felt the rain gather the night back into itself. Daniel Mercer said, "Is there any way back?" Olivia Hart said, "Not from where you went." He stepped into the hallway, and the latch clicked like a clean cut. The hallway swallowed the click of the latch, and the apartment finally breathed like a room without a mask. Olivia Hart said, "I am not broken. I am awake." I gathered the prints, filed them by date, and slid them into an envelope labeled "Done." Marcus Lee said, "You good to be alone?" Olivia Hart said, "I need the quiet to know my name." He squeezed my shoulder and left with a look that felt like guardrails. I stripped the bed of his heat and my doubt, and the sheets sighed like a witness finally off the stand. Daniel Mercer said, "You will regret this in my head," but the room did not echo back. I opened the windows and let the city rinse the walls with cold air and distant traffic. Olivia Hart said, "This is my address again." I placed the brass key in a drawer marked Boundaries and closed it softly, like respect learning a hinge. My hands shook once, then steadied around a mug that tasted like morning before the storm learned my name. The rain quit, and the skyline looked washed and possible, and I felt the outline of a life that could fit me again. By noon, I sat with a stack of forms that turned chaos into boxes and signatures, and my name looked heavier in ink. Olivia Hart said, "Remove the secondary user and send me confirmation." The bank clerk typed, and the shared card vanished like a ghost from my wallet. I forwarded the lease addendum and attached photos of the signed initials and the brass key. Marcus Lee said, "Paper first, feelings later." I answered, work emails I had dodged, and I told the truth in 3 sentences that did not spill. Olivia Hart said, "I will be offline today for personal reasons." The words felt small and exact, and that was the point, because drama can starve when you do not feed it. I ordered a new lock and scheduled the install, and the confirmation ping steadied my pulse. Daniel Mercer said, "We can talk after you cool off," by text I did not open. Olivia Hart said, "Cooling is not the same as forgetting." The city brightened between clouds, and the sidewalk steamed, and my steps began to sound like decisions. I booked a session with a therapist whose calendar had one opening, and I clicked it like a lifeline. Olivia Hart said, "I want tools, not a loop." Harper asked to meet near the lake where the path curls under maples, and I chose daylight because truth prefers open sky. Harper Lane said, "I am sorry in ways that will not help you." Olivia Hart said, "Then help me by hearing all of it." She rubbed her thumb along the red scarf like it was a rosary for bad choices. Harper Lane said, "He claimed you were drifting." She said, "I let that lie rent my attention." Olivia Hart said, "Drift is not consent." She named the lunches and the messages and the borrowed key. She admitted the ways she avoided saying my name. Harper Lane said, "You can tell my manager if you need to." Olivia Hart said, "I will handle my side, and you can handle your reflection." A dog shook lake water onto our shoes, and the chill felt earned. Harper Lane said, "You were kind to me before I knew you." She said, "I forgot that when it mattered." Olivia Hart said, "I was kind to me today." We parted without hugging. The path felt longer and clearer. My shadow looked like someone I could keep. The geese argued on the water like a chorus that refused to pick sides. I walked away without looking back, and that was the win. At dusk I bought a new basil plant from the corner stand, and the leaves smelled like promises that knew how to grow. Marcus Lee said, Need help moving furniture? Olivia Hart said, I can lift this life. We pushed the couch away from the window and made space for a small desk that faced the sky. I opened a blank document and titled it, Boundaries, and the cursor blinked like a lighthouse. Olivia Hart said, no spare keys without names. Olivia Hart said, no silence that hides the cost. The therapist confirmed our session with a line that felt like scaffolding. Marcus Lee said, you kept your voice, and that kept you. I brewed tea that did not pretend to fix anything, and tasted like warmth anyway. Daniel Mercer said, I hate how this ended, inside a voicemail I did not press. Olivia Hart said, I like how I continued. I watered the basil and set it by the sill where the rain traced gentle lines down the glass. The apartment held its new shape without creaking, and the floor finally felt level under my feet. I saved the document and backed it up, because lessons deserve the cloud and the heart. The city hummed, and the hum sounded like permission. Night fell clean and cool, and the city stacked its lights like new pages, and I stepped onto the fire escape to breathe. The metal was cold, and the air held the last taste of rain, and I watched a ferry cut the water in a straight white line. Marcus Lee said, proud of you by text, and I let the words land and do their quiet work. Olivia Hart said, tomorrow I change the locks and the passwords and the story I tell myself. I thought about the years I gave to hope, and I saw how hope can survive truth without pretending it is a plan. A neighbor tuned a guitar and missed 2 notes, and the miss felt human and forgivable, in a way lies are not. I opened Daniel's thread and scrolled past the old sweetness that now read like captions under a storm. Olivia Hart said, you taught me what I will never accept again. I typed a message and deleted it, because power sometimes lives in the unsent thing. Then I wrote one line that fit the shape of my new spine and the size of the night. Olivia Hart said, you did not think I would ever find out, did you?